Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm back out here working on the Falcon, and today is going to be part 2 of the Mustang II suspension install. Today I'm going to be modifying the steering column and I will be getting it hooked up to the steering rack. Alright, so I want to talk about my steering column here. I debated whether I want to buy a new steering column or convert the one I have. New steering columns are great. I mean, you can get a tilt column, a telescoping column, but they're so expensive. So for now, I think I'm going to convert the one I have to work with the rack and pinion steering. But there are several things you have to do to make that happen. You got to take this nut off the top. And if you've not taken this off, you'll have to thread some bolts in here and use a puller like this. Then under here, you're going to have a spring. There's a bushing right in here, kind of a split tapered bushing. Now, I've also taken all of the turn signal linkage out. Once you get this collar off by loosening these nuts, then the actual shift collar comes off. Then this whole tube will slide off. When I pull this off, you'll see there is a bushing right here. This rubber bushing fits snug inside the column tube, pilots onto the original steering gearbox. When converting this to a rack and pinion, you've got to cut the shaft off right here and either weld on or grind flat spots to go to a double D. But once you do that, it's no longer supported on this end. There's, a large hole through here for the steering shaft to go through. So there are aftermarket bearings for sale that go into the end of this housing and support your actual steering shaft. I've not bought one yet, but I found one online that has some screws that you drill holes in. So it kind of taps in and then it's held in place with some screws. I don't know what length I'm going to want it, so I'm just going to cut this thing off as long as I can right now. I might end up shortening it. The other thing to note is that this was an automatic car, so there was a shift tube, spring, and a shift arm. The shift arm used to come out right through here, so I'll probably end up welding a little plate over here. Probably make a little plate that goes over this right here. This is where the switch connected for the, I believe this would be the neutral safety switch. So there's a little contact strip right here. It's either that or it was a reverse. I can't remember what it was. Of course, this will no longer be needed because it's a manual transmission now. You can buy another one of these shift collars that was for a floor shift car, as well as this top collar for a floor shift car. In 62, they didn't make a floor shift, but I think in 63 and throughout the rest of the 60s, the same collars were used in the Falcons. I'll show you when I've got stuff mocked up and some of the parts purchased that I will need. All right, so as you can see right here, I have installed the power rack. Here's my existing steering column. I have not modified the steering column yet. You can see that it sticks out pretty far past the firewall, probably 3.5 inches on the bottom. Using this breaker bar, I can kind of approximate where my steering shaft needs to go. Slide it into this U-joint, and if I were to not shorten the steering column, my steering shaft would probably hit my frame, because in the end of my steering column, I'm going to be putting this bushing with a bearing that's going to support the steering shaft. That's going to be in there like that. And then I've got to have a shaft collar to lock the steering shaft from sliding up towards the steering wheel. Then I got to have my steering U-joint. So that's a pretty big stack up. So you can kind of picture if this was all lined up at that angle, you'd probably put my steering shaft right into the frame. So I'm definitely going to be shortening it. The actual column itself. Just trying to determine how much. It's looking to me like I'm probably just going to want to cut this off as close to the firewall as I can. This steering column also has to be supported right now. I have it clamped up by the steering wheel, but there's nothing that holds it down by the firewall. you've got to support this. So I'm probably going to take the factory plate that held the little rubber diaphragm on the firewall, and I'm going to take it, use it as a pattern, and make a heavier plate, probably like a 10 gauge plate, maybe even thinner. And then I have a piece of DOM tubing that should slide right over the steering column. I'm actually going to make a collar welded into that plate. So I'm going to go ahead and measure some stuff out, and then take the steering column out, make a cut on that. All right, so I've got my steering column clamped up here in my saw. I determined that the best place to cut it is going to be right along this side of the slot right here. There's a little like stamped rib in here, and when I cut it, there's still going to be like a little sleeve left inside, and I'm going to have to drill out a few spot welds to get that little sleeve out so that my bearing retainer can actually fit in there properly. All right, so here is the steering column cut off, and you can see there's just tiny little, 4 little tiny little pieces of metal that are still left in here. This is the piece that was cut off. Little plug welds. Looks like there's 4 of them. So I think I can just almost peel this metal off and break that spot weld. And then I won't have to actually drill these spot welds out. Just probably smooth it out with a little sandpaper bit or something like that. There's some little tabs of metal inside that I ended up just kind of wiggling back and forth with a pair of pliers, and the spot weld broke off. Then I took a little die grinder, smoothed it out a little bit. On the outside, there are some pretty big divots from the spot weld, so I actually just zapped it a little bit with my MIG welder, ground them down, sanded it so it's all nice and smooth. Just laid out where I want to drill the holes for the retaining screws for my support bearing. So I'm going to go ahead and drill those holes out. All right, got my holes drilled, cleaned all the burrs off. I'm going to see how my little bushing here fits. Looks like it's a little snug fit, so that's good. Pretty good snug fit. This one is slightly hard to get to here. The holes aren't perfectly spaced probably, but very close. I think I might actually need to take a tiny little die grinder to that hole. All right, so I'm getting ready to fit the steering column back in so I can tack my bracket together that is going to hold the steering column down to the firewall. Here are the original 2-piece plates that bolted the rubber diaphragm down. You can see I put some tack welds in here to hold them together. And then I took them out and made another plate, a 1-piece plate here. About a 14 gauge. There's a little bit of rust on it. Might be hard to see, but I've got the holes traced out where the holes are going to go. And then this larger kind of circle you see right in here, this is the opening from the original retainer plates down in here. So this will give me something to measure off of when I stick the steering column through. Going to measure off of the old plates, and then I'll have some reference point to lay out the holes for this, because this piece of tubing right here is going to be welded into this plate, and then the steering column will slide inside this tube. This is a piece of DOM tubing. It'll fit nice and snug. Let me get it all bolted in place, and then I'll show you how I'm measuring it. Okay, so you can see right here the steering column, it's clamped down tight by the steering wheel, but it floats around on here. So the steering column originally was pretty centered up and down and right to left in the factory sheet metal shroud here. So I went ahead and measured kind of the gap side to side, up and down. Actually used this marker as kind of a feeler gauge. So I'll measure in, and then I'll just kind of trace my oval here, and then I'll cut this out. All right, so you can see here I have my retainer plate bolted up to the firewall, and the collar that supports the bottom of the steering column tacked in place. I only have the outside tacked right now. I'm going to undo these bolts slide the steering column out and then fully weld the outside. Probably I might just stitch weld the inside, I'm not sure. Alright guys, you can see right here on the inside of my column support bracket, I am installing weld nuts to make installation a lot easier. All right, so I finished welding my column support bracket. Just to show you some of the details here. So I ended up fully welding around the, I guess what I'd call the bottom and the top. Not for strength purposes necessarily, but really just for aesthetic reasons. Also ended up adding the weld nuts to the inside right in here. I think that it adds a nice finished look, but also makes it way easier to install. Then I also added a notch right here to the collar, 180 degrees out, both sides. And this notch basically allows a band clamp to tighten down on the steering column. Right now, I mean, they're snug. There's no movement between the two. So pretty happy with how that turned out. All right, so I have all of my steering column and steering shaft components here on the bench. So here's my brand new Grant 13-inch steering wheel. Pretty excited about this. I like how it looks, and I think it'll have a really good feel with the power steering rack. And then here is, of course, the steering column that's modified, the steering shaft, which is cut down, and I'll look at that in a little more detail. And then at the very end, I've got a short section of 3/4 double B shaft and a 3/4 by 3/4 double B steering U-joint. This end over here will hook to the steering rack. On this end, I have my 3/4 by 3/4 double B U-joint, and it'll hook to this right here. This is the original steering shaft that I cut down. Then I ground 2 flat spots on it carefully with a pair of calipers, measuring it occasionally, and I ended up getting a really nice fit with the steering joint here. So pretty happy with that fit. Next we have a lock collar right here. This is what keeps the shaft from sliding towards the steering wheel. Then I have a little spacer right here. This spacer makes sure that all of the thrust loading only rides on that inner race of the bearing and keeps the lock collar from rubbing on this outer housing of this pilot bearing. All right, down here at the other end, we've got the bearing that's already in the housing of the, called the flange, the tube flange. And then I've got my original tapered bushing. This is steel. I know replacements are plastic. That'll go on there. After that, you got the spring. This is the original spring. When they revised these tube collars for the, I think it was 63 or 64. This is the manual transmission version. They made the depth slightly deeper right here, and so I had to make a spacer so that I had enough tension on my spring. I could get a later year spring, and everything would fit, and I could do that someday. All right, so after that, then the steering wheel itself goes on. And then, of course, you've got your spring right here, goes down, the nut on the end of the shaft, and the horn button. All right, my modified steering column is all done and ready to be put back in the car. I think it looks pretty awesome. All right, time to see how this steering column fits. I'm going to slide the bottom of the steering column in with the column support bracket already attached because it's still in the same position as when I fit everything up. All right, I got it in the hole there, the firewall, and a little fiddly here to get this bracket. Got the top bracket and then the strap that goes under it here. We got 2 bolts, which are actually kind of studs. Just gonna go ahead and get these studs started, leave them a little bit loose. Then I will go put the bolts in the column support bracket. All right, I've got these bolts up top here on the clamp, just a little bit loose still. So I'm going to head over to the engine bay and get those bolts started on the support bracket. All right, I got to get it lined up here. I won't be able to get one of the bolts in because it's actually just behind this brake booster here. But that's fine, I can put that in later. Some of you might be wondering, what is this master cylinder brake booster? It is out of a 92 Geo Metro. Back in the day, it was kind of the popular swap that everyone was doing. It does fit well, but I'll probably replace it someday with something else. All right, I finished tightening all these bolts up here on the column support bracket, so I'm just going to go ahead back in the car and tighten up those column clamp bolts real quick. All right, I got my section of 3/4 double D and the steering wheel joint here. I'm going to see if I can get everything together here without taking the steering rack loose. I'm pretty sure I'll be able to slide things in far enough to get the joint started. Let's see here. Oh yeah, I think so. It'll be a little bit tight. All right, had a little bit of trouble there, but I had just enough room to get this double B shaft in by sliding the U-joints all the way down the shaft. So I thought I was going to have to take the steering rack loose, but I got it. I'm going to start by getting the U-joint down here on the steering rack centered because it has a little groove that I want to get it centered in. I'm going to get that one locked down, then I'll go ahead and center the other 2 U-joints and get my shaft here centered where I want it. All right, so I got all of the set screws and their locking nuts tight. One thing that I will do though before I disassemble this is I'm going to take each set screw loose one at a time, and I'm going to mark the shaft probably with a little transfer punch, and then reinstall the set screw, do the other one so it doesn't move around on me. And then when I disassemble this, I'm going to take a little drill bit and I'll drill a little divot on the shaft give the set screw a place to lock into, so it'll never move around on the shaft. Also, I'll put Loctite on all of these things when I do it for the final installation. All right, well, there it is. Steering shaft complete. Hooked up all the way to the steering rack. Can't wait to get the tires on here and see how this thing turns. All right, so I'm going to put my horn button on here, but one thing that's really difficult is to get the spring to stay while you're doing this. So one little trick is to take a little piece of masking tape, kind of just put it over the end of the spring, and then just tape it in there. The masking tape will just be along for the ride. Doesn't really matter. The horn switch will still make contact. Press it down. That's it. That's good. All right, guys, so this is going to wrap up part 2 of the Mustang II suspension install in the Falcon. The steering system is all hooked up, ready to go, but I still have quite a few things left to wrap up this project. I got to install the coil springs, the shock absorbers, the rotors, brake calipers, brake lines, and then I also have to take care of these holes right here that I have in my inner fenders. So stick around for that. Go ahead, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out. And as always, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.